Chapter 1. Before New York was New York. Long before steel scraped the sky and taxi horns echoed through canyons of concrete, before Wall Street trades and Broadway lights, there was a different rhythm to the land now called New York. It was the sound of wind through ancient forests, of rivers moving slow and deep, of footsteps on hunting trails worn smooth by generations. This place, these forests, rivers, and shores, was once the homeland of a people who knew it not as property or commodity, but as life itself. They called themselves the Lenape. The Lenape, often translated as the people or true people, had lived in the region for thousands of years, long before any European sail breached the horizon. Their territory stretched broadly, from the Delaware River Valley up through modern-day New Jersey, eastern Pennsylvania, and southeastern New York. But it was in the lower Hudson River Valley, what we now call Manhattan, Brooklyn, Staten Island, and the surrounding areas, that a vibrant network of Lenape communities flourished. Here, life was bound not by borders or kings, but by cycles of seasons, rivers, and respect for the land. This was a world of rivers and estuaries, where fresh water met salt, and where fish were so plentiful in spring they could be caught with bare hands. The Hudson River was not yet named for any European explorer. It was known simply as Muhiacantuk, the river that flows both ways, for its curious tidal rhythm. The surrounding forests were dense with oak, maple, and chestnut trees, their nuts forming the backbone of the Lenape diet, along with corn, beans, and squash. The three sisters cultivated in rich earth, cleared with stone tools and fire. Deer roamed the woods. Beavers shaped wetlands. The Lenape hunted, fished, gathered, and farmed, not in isolation, but in harmony with a land they believed was shared, never owned. Their settlements dotted the landscape in clusters, small kin-based communities rather than sprawling cities. Longhouses built from bent saplings and bark provided shelter for extended families. Villages were often seasonal, shifting from coastal fishing camps in summer to inland hunting lodges in winter. Life moved with nature's pulse, not in defiance of it. The Lenape were far from primitive. Their society was rich in structure, knowledge, and meaning. They had clear clan systems, wolf, turtle, and turkey, with leadership shared through councils and consensus rather than hierarchy. Women held power in many aspects of social life, including the right to select tribal leaders. Stories passed down through oral tradition told of creation, of spirits in the rivers and stars, of past migrations and ancestral wisdom. Their spirituality was not confined to temples or books. It was everywhere, in every stone, every tree, every animal hunted with thanks and reverence. Trade was central to their way of life, not as exploitation, but as exchange of goods, stories, and alliances. The Lenape were master canoe builders, carving vessels from tulip poplar trees, sleek enough to glide down rivers and sturdy enough to cross bays. Their trade network stretched as far as the Great Lakes, the Chesapeake Bay, and even the Mississippi Valley. They exchanged furs, shells, copper, food, and medicinal plants in intricate systems of barter and reciprocity. Wampum, delicately carved beads from clamshells, was more than currency. It was memory, treaty, and sacred bond, woven into belts that recorded history and solemn vows. And yet, for all this richness, the Lenape way of life would prove tragically vulnerable to what was coming. By the early 1600s, whispers of strange ships and pale-skinned men had already reached the edges of Lenape lands. Disease preceded the explorers, smallpox and measles wiping out entire villages before contact had even been made. What followed was not a single moment of invasion, but a slow, corrosive erosion of sovereignty and survival. But in this chapter of the land's story, before any of that, the Lenape thrived. They were not waiting to be discovered. They were living lives of depth and meaning, with a culture older than any colony and wisdom deeper than any canal. Imagine standing at the southern tip of Manhattan, not a forest of glass towers, but of cedar and pine. No ferries, no subways. Just the sound of water and wind, and perhaps the distant call of a Lenape fisherman, his canoe gliding silently past. This was Mannahatta, the island of many hills. Its streams ran clear, its soil was rich, its people knew it as home. The world they inhabited was not untouched wilderness, but a carefully managed ecosystem, sculpted by thousands of years of human presence. The Lenape burned underbrush to clear hunting paths and enrich the soil. They harvested only what they needed, leaving enough for next season and next generation. They believed that everything had spirit, and that balance, not domination, was the key to survival. This reverence for balance would clash violently with the worldviews that soon arrived on ships flying foreign flags. But for a brief moment in time, before maps were redrawn and names overwritten, the Hudson River flowed through Lenape lands untouched by empire. The wind moved through trees that bore no names like Broadway or Fifth Avenue. And the people who lived there walked gently upon the earth, believing it belonged to no one. They could not know that soon their river would be claimed by a man named Hudson, that their island would be purchased for beads and trinkets, that their villages would be replaced by a grid of streets and stories forgotten by textbooks. But in the beginning, before the towers, before the treaties, before the tragedy, there was a people who knew this land intimately. And it was they, the Lenape, who gave New York its first chapter. Because every empire has its foundations. And before this city became the beating heart of a new world, it was the homeland of a people who knew how to live in tune with the old one. Chapter 2. New Amsterdam Rises. The wind that once whispered through Lenape trees would soon fill the sails of European ships. In 1609, one such ship, a sturdy vessel named Half Mayen, or Half Moon, cut through Atlantic waters and approached the coast of the land now called New York. On board was an Englishman in Dutch service, Henry Hudson. He had been hired by the Dutch East India Company not to find a new continent, but a shortcut, a northeast passage to Asia. What he found instead was a wide river mouth guarded by rocky cliffs and rolling hills, a waterway so promising it would one day bear his name. Hudson guided his ship up this great river, marveling at its calm flow and abundant resources. He met local Lenape people who offered gifts and food, some of whom had already suffered from diseases brought by earlier European contact. Though he never found a passage to Asia, Hudson's journey planted a different kind of seed, a commercial vision of what this new land could become. When the Half Moon turned back, the Dutch saw more than failure. They saw opportunity. Beavers, otters, and foxes, creatures whose pelts could fetch fortunes in Europe, roamed these forests. And so, while Hudson disappeared into history only a few years later on a doomed Arctic voyage, his 1609 exploration had opened the door for something entirely new, a Dutch colony in the heart of the New World. In 1624, the Dutch West India Company established a formal presence on the southern tip of Manhattan, at a place soon named New Amsterdam, New Amsterdam. The company wasn't just a commercial enterprise. It was a semi-sovereign power with the right to wage war, build forts, and govern colonies. It was capitalism with cannons, and it saw the New World not as a land to explore, but as a ledger to balance, unlike the Spanish or English colonies built on gold and conquest. New Amsterdam was built on fur. Beavers, once abundant in Europe, had been hunted to near extinction. But here, in the endless woods of the Northeast, they were plentiful. The Dutch forged trade relationships with the Lenape and Mohawk peoples, exchanging metal tools, textiles, and weapons for beaver pelts. These pelts were then shipped to Amsterdam, where they were transformed into fashionable hats for Europe's upper class. This simple transaction became the economic backbone of the colony. But New Amsterdam was more than a trading post. It was a laboratory for an idea still rare in the 17th century: diversity. The Dutch Republic was already one of Europe's most tolerant societies, and that spirit crossed the Atlantic. Within a few decades, New Amsterdam's muddy streets echoed with dozens of languages. Dutch, yes, but also English, French, German, Danish, Swedish, and a variety of African tongues spoken by enslaved men and women brought against their will. Sephardic Jews fleeing the Inquisition arrived and were, after resistance, begrudgingly allowed to stay. Freed black people, rare in many other colonies, owned property here. Women could inherit land. Indigenous tribes mingled with settlers at the markets. New Amsterdam was chaotic, imperfect, and often ungovernable. But it was also one of the most diverse places on Earth. The city was small, perhaps 1,500 people at its peak under Dutch rule. But it pulsed with ambition. At the southern tip of Manhattan stood Fort Amsterdam, a wooden fortress meant to protect against both rival powers and angry tribes. A palisade was constructed along the northern edge of the settlement to guard against potential threats. That palisade would one day become Wall Street. Beyond the fort, a grid of crooked streets twisted through farms, taverns, and merchant houses. The main road was called Breedweg, or Broadway. That name, too, would survive the centuries. Life in New Amsterdam was rough. The winters were brutal, the governance often weak, and corruption ran deep. The colony's directors came and went, often more interested in lining their pockets than building a lasting society. One tried to sell guns to the English, another sparked a bloody conflict with native tribes through mismanagement. But in 1647, a man arrived who would become the face of Dutch New York: Peter Stuyvesant. Stuyvesant was not a man to be ignored. Tall, stern, and deeply religious, he had lost a leg in the Caribbean during a failed assault on a Spanish island. He walked with a wooden peg, earning him the nickname Peg Leg Pete, though few dared say it to his face. He ruled the colony with an iron fist, imposing discipline where disorder had reigned. He cracked down on smuggling, enforced religious orthodoxy, and tried to make the colony more defensible. But Stuyvesant also clashed with the spirit of the place. He tried to ban Quakers, only to be overruled by the Dutch government back home. He wanted to enforce stricter control, but New Amsterdam thrived on flexibility, trade, and compromise. Underneath his strict policies, something remarkable was happening. Freedom was quietly taking root. When a group of settlers in Flushing protested his persecution of religious minorities in 1657, they signed a document called the Flushing Remonstrance. It was a bold plea for tolerance, and many historians see it as a distant ancestor of the American ideals that would bloom more than a century later. Not everything was noble. The Dutch, like all colonial powers, engaged in violent conflict with native peoples. Promises were broken, land was seized, and wars were fought. In 1643, a brutal series of massacres known as Kieft's War left hundreds dead, including innocent Lenape women and children. Though some Dutch colonists protested these atrocities, the damage was done. Trust was shattered, and the foundation of New Amsterdam was forever stained by the same dark currents that flowed through all of colonial America. Yet the Dutch legacy in New York is surprisingly enduring. They left behind more than just place names: Harlem, Brooklyn, the Bronx, Staten Island. They left behind a mindset: mercantile, pragmatic, pluralistic. They saw the colony not as a holy mission, but as a marketplace. And in doing so, they set the stage for what New York would become: a city open to all, hungry for profit, allergic to stagnation. For 40 years, New Amsterdam held its ground at the edge of empire. But storm clouds gathered. England, expanding its colonies and tightening its grip on the Atlantic, saw New Amsterdam as a prize too valuable to ignore. The Dutch knew their hold was fragile. Their colony was underpopulated, underdefended, and surrounded by English settlements. When 4 English warships appeared in the harbor in 1664, Peter Stuyvesant wanted to fight. He rallied his soldiers, but the townspeople refused. They had families, farms, businesses. A bloodbath would serve no one. So Stuyvesant, the stubborn old soldier, surrendered. The Dutch flag came down, the English flag went up, and New Amsterdam was no more. The city was renamed New York in honor of the Duke of York, brother to King Charles II. It changed hands without a single shot fired. But the story of New York did not begin that day. It had begun decades earlier, with Lenape villages on the riverbanks, with beaver pelts packed into barrels, with tulip poplar canoes gliding through the harbor, and with merchants arguing in half a dozen languages over prices and promises. Even as the English took over, the city's Dutch foundations remained. Streets, customs, families, and freedoms endured. Beneath the Union Jack fluttered a spirit that was harder to conquer, one of enterprise, diversity, and defiant independence. And so the Dutch dream ended not with a fight, but with a quiet bargain. A transfer of power that changed the name, but not the soul. For New York, as it marched into a new era under English rule, carried with it the remnants of New Amsterdam, the grit, the ambition, the openness, and a legacy that would echo through every century to come. Chapter 3. New York is born. The flag changed, but the city remained. On a quiet day in 1664, without a single musket fired, a small and stubborn Dutch colony surrendered to the might of the English crown. Peter Stuyvesant, the peg-legged governor who had once ruled New Amsterdam with an iron will, signed the Articles of Surrender and retreated into history. The Dutch West India Company packed up what it could, and New Amsterdam, the scrappy trading post at the edge of the known world, became New York. The name came from James, Duke of York, brother to King Charles II of England. It was a symbol of royal power and a promise that this place would no longer be a private enterprise, but part of a growing empire. The city was now under English control, but the bones of New Amsterdam were still visible. Its crooked Dutch streets, its windmills, its stubborn multiculturalism. For years, the Dutch language echoed in marketplaces and church pews, and the city's soul remained more like a trading hub than a colony of God-fearing settlers. The English wasted no time reorganizing the city. They introduced English common law, an Anglican church presence, and a stricter social hierarchy. But the city didn't bend easily. It had always been too diverse, too loud, too commercially minded for rigid conformity. Even under new rule, New York was a place of contradiction. A colony where merchants outnumbered ministers, where trade came before religion, and where the old Dutch tolerance clashed with New English authority. Strategically, the location was golden. Nestled between the Puritans of New England and the plantations of the South, New York offered the crown a vital link in its colonial chain. The deep harbor welcomed ships from the Caribbean, Europe, and Africa. The Hudson River opened a gateway into the interior, feeding furs, lumber, and grain into the city's markets. The English saw in New York not just a city, but a keystone, one that could bind their American holdings and project imperial power. But while its value to the crown was clear, life in the city was anything but stable. The transition had been peaceful, but tension simmered beneath the surface. The English brought with them a political system that clashed with local expectations. They appointed royal governors, often arrogant men with little interest in local concerns, and expected obedience. But New Yorkers, whether Dutch, English, or something else entirely, had grown used to managing their own affairs. They weren't eager to be ruled from afar. As the years passed, those tensions only deepened. In 1689, news of the Glorious Revolution in England reached New York. King James II had been overthrown, replaced by William and Mary. In response, a local militia captain named Jacob Leisler seized control of the city, claiming he was acting in defense of Protestant liberty. He ruled for 2 years, establishing a shadow government and earning both admiration and enemies. When the Crown sent troops to retake the colony, Leisler surrendered, but was tried for treason and hanged. His body was buried in disgrace, though later generations would see him as a martyr. The city had tasted rebellion, and the memory would not fade. Meanwhile, New York was growing, not always gracefully, but with relentless momentum. In the early 1700s, it was still small by modern standards, perhaps 5,000 people, but already buzzing with life. The streets were noisy and narrow, clogged with carts and livestock. Markets overflowed with oysters, apples, and rum. Ships lined the docks, unloading sugar from Barbados, wine from France, and enslaved Africans from the Caribbean. Taverns doubled as courtrooms, newsrooms, and political battlegrounds. Merchants grew rich. Apprentices chased opportunity. And at the center of it all was the promise that anyone, if they worked hard enough, might carve out a piece of the city for themselves. But beneath the promise was a shadow. By the early 18th century, New York had become a major port in the transatlantic slave trade. Africans were bought, sold, and branded at auction blocks, not far from where the stock exchange would one day rise. Some were sold into brutal plantation work in the South. Others stayed in the city, forced to labor in kitchens, stables, docks, and homes. Enslaved people made up as much as 20% of New York's population, men and women whose names are mostly lost to history, but whose toil helped build the city brick by brick. Tensions flared in 1712, when a group of enslaved Africans staged a violent rebellion. Armed with hatchets and torches, they set fires and attacked white colonists in the night. The uprising was quickly crushed, but the response was swift and brutal. Dozens were executed, laws were tightened, surveillance grew, fear spread. And yet, the conditions that had caused the uprising remained: cruelty, exploitation, and the refusal to recognize a shared humanity. As the decades passed, New York's identity sharpened. It was a city defined by contrast. wealth and poverty, freedom and bondage, elegance and filth. At the top were merchant families, building dynasties from sugar and shipping. Their homes lined Broadway and Pearl Street, filled with imported furniture and silverware. They sent their sons to Europe for education and their daughters to marry well. Below them were laborers, artisans, sailors, and slaves, people who kept the wheels of the city turning but rarely shared in its prosperity. The city was also a place of ideas. Printing presses hummed with pamphlets, sermons, and broadsheets. Debates raged in taverns and salons. In 1735, one such debate exploded into a landmark trial. A printer named John Peter Zenger had published articles criticizing the royal governor. He was arrested for libel. But his lawyer, Andrew Hamilton, argued that truth was a defense, even if it embarrassed the powerful. The jury agreed. Zenger was acquitted, and the case became a cornerstone in the emerging idea of freedom of the press. By the mid-17th century, New York was no longer a colonial outpost. It was a true city, diverse, dynamic, and deeply entangled in the global currents of trade and politics. Its population had swelled to over 20,000. Elegant churches rose beside slave markets. Sophisticated theaters hosted plays while filth flowed through open gutters. The city was constantly rebuilding, expanding northward, flattening forests, filling marshes. It had no single religion, no dominant language, no fixed identity. And that was its strength. New York could be English, Dutch, African, Jewish, German, or something new entirely. It was becoming the prototype of the modern American city, layered, restless, and impossible to pin down. But that same restlessness made it dangerous to rule. The British governors who arrived from London often found themselves overwhelmed, frustrated by the city's refusal to bend. Taxes were resisted, trade laws were ignored, smugglers outmaneuvered the crown's ships. And under it all, the feeling grew that New York was not just a city in the British Empire, but a city with a mind of its own. As the 1760s approached, that feeling turned into something more potent. Across the colonies, the Crown imposed new taxes to pay for its wars. In New York, merchants and workers alike balked. Protests erupted. Effigies of British officials were hanged from lampposts. Crowds gathered in front of City Hall. The Sons of Liberty, a secret society of agitators and dreamers, began to organize. Their messages spread through taverns, print shops, and whispered conversations on moonlit docks. New Yorkers, once loyal subjects of the king, were beginning to ask dangerous questions. Who truly governed them? Who had the right to tax them? What did liberty mean in a city built by slaves and ruled by merchants? These questions would soon ignite not just New York, but an entire continent. But before revolution, there was rumble. Before independence, there was resistance. And in those final years under the British Crown, New York stood at a crossroads, caught between its past as a colony of empire and its future as a capital of rebellion. Chapter 4. New York and the War for Independence. By the early 1770s, the mood in New York City was shifting. What had once been grumbling in taverns and editorials in newspapers was becoming something more dangerous. A roar. Across the 13 colonies, the British Crown's grip tightened. Taxes were raised. Customs officials grew bolder. The Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, the Tea Act. To London, these were reasonable policies to fund the empire's debts. But to many New Yorkers, they were shackles, forged across an ocean by men who had never walked their streets, smelled their harbor, or understood their lives. And yet, The city was not united in outrage. New York was deeply divided. On one side were the patriots, many of them merchants and tradesmen, who believed in the promise of independence and resented every British tax and troop. They met in secret, organized boycotts, and printed pamphlets calling for liberty. On the other side were the loyalists, wealthy landowners, Anglican clergy, government officials, who still believed in the crown and feared the chaos of rebellion more than the burden of British rule. Between them were the cautious, the silent, the unsure. Friends, neighbors, and even families found themselves on opposite sides of a growing chasm. When the first shots rang out at Lexington and Concord in 1775, New York held its breath. It was still technically under British control, but revolution was in the air. George Washington, newly appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, knew New York would be a critical battleground. Whoever held the city held the Hudson River, and with it, the power to split the colonies in two. Washington marched into Manhattan with his ragtag army in the summer of 1776, determined to defend it. But defense would prove nearly impossible. In August, British General William Howe arrived with the largest expeditionary force Britain had ever launched. A fleet of over 400 ships, and more than 30,000 troops. The Battle of Long Island was swift and brutal. Washington's men, poorly trained and outnumbered, were driven back. Under the cover of fog, he orchestrated a daring nighttime retreat across the East River, saving the heart of his army from total destruction. It was not a victory, but it was survival. And it would not be the last time Washington slipped through the fingers of an empire. With Washington gone, the British occupied New York. The city, once a hotbed of revolutionary sentiment, became the largest loyalist stronghold in North America. Redcoats patrolled the streets. Churches were converted into barracks. Civil liberties vanished. And the fear set in. For nearly 7 years, from 1776 to 1783, New York would remain under British control. A city occupied by its own former rulers, watched by its own neighbors, and fractured from within. The occupation was not just political, it was suffocating. Food grew scarce. Prices soared. Disease spread. Loyalists flooded in from other colonies, seeking refuge. Patriots fled or were arrested. Thousands of black men and women escaped slavery and came to New York, lured by British promises of freedom for those who fled their patriot masters. Some found liberty, others betrayal. Many were forced into British labor regiments or shipped to other colonies. The city's population swelled and groaned under the weight of war and survival. Then came the fire. On the night of September 21st, 1776, just weeks after the British had taken control, flames tore through lower Manhattan. Fanned by wind and panic, the fire raged for hours, destroying nearly a quarter of the city. Trinity Church burned to the ground. Hundreds of homes and businesses were reduced to ash. In the chaos, blame spread like smoke. The British accused the rebels of sabotage. Patriots claimed it was divine punishment for occupation. Arrests followed. Some were executed. But the truth was never fully uncovered. The fire had changed the landscape of the city and made the occupation even more desperate. Yet even in darkness, resistance burned. With the city crawling with British soldiers, a different kind of war began. One fought not with muskets, but with whispers. The Culper spy ring, organized under Washington's orders, operated in secret from 1778 to 1783. Farmers, merchants, tavern owners, and even a Long Island woman known only as Agent 355 passed coded messages, mapped troop movements, and fed intelligence to the Continental Army. Using invisible ink, dead drops, and carefully coded letters, they outwitted British command again and again. Their work helped Washington avoid ambushes, intercept supply shipments, and plan campaigns. They operated in the shadow of gallows, knowing discovery meant death. But they endured. In a city full of informants and danger, they kept the flicker of rebellion alive. Outside the city, the war raged on. Battles were fought in fields, forests, and swamps from Saratoga to Savannah. But New York remained frozen, a city under foreign occupation in its own country. And while soldiers fought and died elsewhere, New Yorkers waited. They waited through harsh winters and hot summers. They waited while their sons joined militias and their daughters worked as nurses or spies. They waited through rumors of peace and threats of betrayal. For 7 long years, New York was a city on hold, burned, broken, but not yet defeated. Then finally, the end came. In 1781, British General Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown. Though the war technically dragged on for 2 more years, the outcome was clear. The Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783. Independence was recognized, and the British prepared to leave. On November 25th, 1783, Evacuation Day, they marched out of New York City for the last time. Washington returned, greeted not by fireworks or parades, but by a quiet and grateful city. The occupation was over. New York, long divided and battered, could begin to rebuild. What remained was a shell of the city it once was. Buildings lay in ruins. Fortunes had vanished. Families were still split along political lines. But in that destruction was opportunity. Freed from British control, New York could chart its own course, not as a colony, but as a city in a new nation. And it did. The ports reopened, merchants returned, immigrants began to arrive once again. Loyalists who had fled to Canada were replaced by entrepreneurs, veterans, and dreamers. The city began to reassert itself, not just as a place of trade, but as a symbol of rebirth. From the ashes of occupation and civil war, New York would rise, rougher, freer, and more determined than ever to shape its own destiny. It had been a city of empires, a battleground of ideas, a pawn in the games of kings. But now, as the smoke of war finally cleared, New York was something new. A city not just in the United States, but of the United States. Chapter 5. Capital of a New Nation. The smoke of revolution had barely lifted when New York entered a new chapter. In November of 1783, British troops finally marched out of the city they had occupied for 7 long years. Evacuation Day, as it came to be known, was a celebration of endurance. Crowds filled the streets. Bells rang. George Washington himself rode into Manhattan to reclaim it for the new United States. It was not just the end of occupation. It was the beginning of a transformation. The war had left New York battered, divided, and half in ruins. But now, for the first time, the city stood not as a colony of an empire, but as a cornerstone of a republic. The new United States was fragile. 13 states, each with their own priorities, were loosely bound by the Articles of Confederation. The question of how to govern such a sprawling and divided land loomed large. And in the midst of that uncertainty, New York began to emerge as a place where the future could be tested. Its port was bustling again, its merchants eager to rebuild fortunes, its people restless for opportunity. Despite scars from the occupation, the city pulsed with energy, as though aware that history had given it a second chance. That chance became reality in 1789. Congress had decided that New York would serve as the temporary capital of the new nation, while a permanent site was chosen. Philadelphia and other cities competed for the honor. But for a few brief and remarkable years, New York became the beating heart of the United States. The streets that had once echoed with British boots now hummed with debates about liberty, finance, and governance. And at the center of it all stood one towering figure, George Washington. On April 30th, 1789, Washington took the oath of office as the first President of the United States on the balcony of Federal Hall, located at the corner of Wall and Broad Streets. Crowds pressed close, cheering as he raised his hand and swore to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. The scene was both humble and monumental. A former colony, once ruled by kings across the sea, was now home to a government chosen by its own people. The first capital of the United States was not Philadelphia, not Washington, D.C., but New York. Those early years of the Republic were filled with uncertainty, and New York reflected it. Washington, reserved and dignified, set precedents with every decision, from how to address the president to how to form a cabinet. Congress met in New York, passing laws that would shape the nation's foundations. The Bill of Rights was debated and approved here. Treaties were signed. For a brief time, the center of American political gravity lay not in Virginia plantations or New England town halls, but in the streets of Lower Manhattan. Politics, however, were only part of the story. While Washington and Congress debated constitutions and rights, another force was rising that would shape New York even more profoundly: finance. At the end of the Revolution, the new nation was deeply in debt. Soldiers had been paid in paper notes, the government owed money to foreign creditors, and the economy was fragile. Into this uncertainty stepped Alexander Hamilton, Washington's brilliant and ambitious Secretary of the Treasury. Hamilton understood that if the United States was to survive, it needed more than political ideals. It needed economic stability. And he saw New York as the place to build it. In 1790, he proposed that the federal government assume the state's Revolutionary War debts, consolidating them into a single national debt. He pushed for the creation of a national bank. He envisioned a financial system that would bind the country together, encourage investment, and give the fledgling United States credibility abroad. Not everyone agreed. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison opposed Hamilton's vision, fearing it would favor the wealthy and concentrate too much power in the hands of bankers. But Hamilton's plan carried the day, and as it did, Wall Street began to transform. What had once been little more than a thoroughfare near the old Dutch Palisade now became the heart of American finance. In 1792, a group of 24 stockbrokers signed an agreement under a buttonwood tree on Wall Street. They pledged to trade securities only with each other and set rules for transactions. This buttonwood agreement would become the seed of the New York Stock Exchange. From that moment on, the financial future of the United States would be tied to the cobblestones of Wall Street. The effect was immediate. Merchants, speculators, and investors flocked to New York. Ships arrived daily, carrying goods from Europe, the Caribbean, and Asia. Sugar, rum, cotton, and tea filled warehouses. Immigrants, drawn by rumors of opportunity, began to arrive in greater numbers once more. Germans, Irish, and French refugees from Revolution found their way into the city. The rhythms of the port grew louder. The city, still scarred from fire and war, began to expand northward beyond its colonial core. Life in the city reflected both promise and struggle. On Broadway, elegant homes rose, their owners eager to display wealth and sophistication. Theaters staged plays that mingled European classics with American themes. Taverns filled with sailors and apprentices eager for drink, gossip, and news. At the same time, poverty remained visible. Many families displaced during the war lived in crowded tenements. Disease was a constant threat. The contrasts that had always defined New York, wealth beside want, elegance beside squalor, were sharper than ever. Infrastructure slowly improved. Roads were extended north, cutting through farmland and forest. Ferries connected Manhattan to Brooklyn and New Jersey. Wooden pipes carried fresh water from streams into the city, though clean water remained scarce. A new prison, called Bridewell, was built. Public markets expanded. The city government, still fragile, struggled to balance the needs of a growing population with limited resources. But the energy was unmistakable. New York was no longer just a colonial outpost or a military stronghold. It was a city of ambition, hungry to claim its place in the world. Culturally, too, the city was changing. Newspapers flourished, their presses printing not only political debates, but also advertisements, poetry, and serialized stories. Coffee houses became hubs of conversation, where merchants and politicians mingled. Churches of every denomination competed for congregants, reflecting the religious diversity that had been part of New York since its Dutch beginnings. A small but growing free black community established itself, despite persistent discrimination. Jewish families continued to build congregations, adding to the city's mosaic. It was as though the pluralism of New Amsterdam had survived the wars and occupations, and was now blooming again under the banner of the United States. And yet, New York's status as the nation's capital was short-lived. Politics once again shifted the balance. In 1790, as part of a compromise engineered by Hamilton, Jefferson, and Madison, the capital would be moved to Philadelphia temporarily, and then to a new site along the Potomac River, what would become Washington, D.C. The decision disappointed New Yorkers, who had grown used to the presence of Congress and the prestige of hosting the nation's leaders. On December 1790, the federal government left for Philadelphia, and New York ceased to be the capital of the United States. But if the city lost political power, it gained something far more lasting. In the years it had served as capital, it had established itself as indispensable. The nation might legislate elsewhere, but money, ships, and trade were centered here. Wall Street was no longer just a street. It was a force. The stock market began to influence not just New York merchants, but investors across the young republic. Banks multiplied. Insurance companies grew. New York was on its way to becoming the financial capital of America. By 1800, the city's population had climbed to nearly 60,000, making it the largest in the United States. Its skyline, still dominated by church steeples, hinted at ambition. Its harbor was a forest of masts, connecting the city to the world. And its people, a mix of languages, faiths, and traditions, were forging a culture unlike any other. The Revolution had freed New York from empire, and the brief years as capital had introduced it to power. Now, as the 19th century dawned, New York was ready to grow, not as the capital of a nation, but as the capital of opportunity. It had begun as a Dutch trading post, surrendered peacefully to the English, endured occupation and fire, and played host to the birth of a republic. Now, as the United States entered a new century, New York carried within it both scars and seeds. scars of battles and divisions that would never fully vanish, seeds of commerce, finance, and diversity that would one day make it the greatest city in the world. Chapter 6. The Immigration Boom. By the start of the 19th century, New York City had already undergone multiple rebirths. It had been Dutch, then English, then American. It had been occupied and liberated. It had been a capital city and a financial experiment. But now it was something else entirely. An engine of motion, a magnet pulling people from every corner of the world. In the decades after 1800, New York exploded. Its streets grew louder, its skyline rose higher, and its population swelled faster than anyone could have imagined. The future had arrived, and it came by ship. In the early decades of the century, the city's harbor filled with sails. Every week, sometimes every day, new ships arrived carrying families, individuals, dreamers, and survivors. They came from Ireland, fleeing famine, from Germany, escaping revolution, from Italy, Poland, and Scandinavia, from the Caribbean, from everywhere. Some came with skills, some with only hope. All came with the same goal: to start over in a city where starting over seemed possible. Immigration to New York wasn't a trickle. It was a wave, and it changed the city forever. In 1800, the city's population stood at roughly 60,000. By 1850, it had surpassed 500,000. A decade later, it was closing in on 1 million. These weren't just numbers. They were people who brought their languages, religions, foods, fears, and traditions into a city that was already humming with contradictions. For many immigrants, the journey began long before they ever saw the Statue of Liberty. Because at this point, there was no statue. That iconic figure would not arrive until later. But the promise she eventually came to symbolize was already alive in the hearts of those who sailed into New York Harbor. Before Ellis Island opened as an official processing center in 1892, most arrivals were inspected at Castle Garden, a repurposed fort at the tip of Manhattan. There were no welcome parades, no handouts, just paperwork, inspections, and the chaos of finding a place to begin. The Irish arrived in massive numbers starting in the 1840s, driven from their homeland by the Great Famine. They were often poor, illiterate, and Catholic, three strikes in the eyes of many native-born Americans. They were mocked in newspapers, discriminated against in hiring, and blamed for crime, disease, and drunkenness. But they came anyway, in droves. They took the hardest jobs, digging canals, hauling bricks, cleaning houses. They settled in tight clusters, often in the 5 Points neighborhood, where poverty mixed with resilience and a new urban Irish identity was born. The Germans followed close behind, pushed by political unrest and economic hardship. They brought with them different skills. Many were artisans, bakers, brewers, and craftsmen. Some settled in what would become Klein Deutschland, or Little Germany, on the Lower East Side. They opened beer gardens and music halls, built Lutheran churches, and formed a quieter but deeply rooted community that would shape the cultural landscape of the city, together with smaller groups from Italy, France, England, and beyond. These immigrants filled the tenements. Narrow, cramped apartment buildings thrown up to meet the tidal wave of need. In these tenements, entire families lived in single rooms. Children slept 3 to a bed. Hallways reeked of waste and damp clothes. Water was scarce, light and air even scarcer. Disease spread fast: cholera, typhus, tuberculosis. But these buildings also echoed with life. Lullabies in Gaelic, arguments in Yiddish, laughter in Italian. The tenements were miserable, but they were also alive. As the immigrant population grew, so did a new political reality. The vote, in theory, was a tool of power, and in practice, it became a tool of survival. Into this volatile mix stepped Tammany Hall. Oh, Tammany was not a place. It was a machine. Founded decades earlier as a political society, it had by the mid-19th century become the most powerful political force in New York. It operated like a shadow government, offering food, jobs, and favors in exchange for loyalty. Tammany didn't just tolerate immigrants, it embraced them, especially the Irish. When no one else would hire a hungry man, Tammany would find him work sweeping streets. When no one else would help bury a child, Tammany would cover the cost. In return, it expected votes, and it got them. Elections were won not just with speeches, but with handshakes, envelopes, and sometimes fists. At the top of this machine stood bosses, figures like William Boss Tweed, who would rise to power in the following decades. But even before the height of Tweed's reign, the Tammany system was already entrenched. It was corrupt, no question. Money vanished into pockets. City contracts were awarded to friends. But for many immigrants, it was also the first institution that treated them as something more than a burden. Tammany helped build loyalty to the Democratic Party in New York that would last generations. Still, politics alone couldn't contain the pressure building in the city. The infrastructure strained under the weight of its people. Horses pulled carriages through mud-filled streets. Fires raged through wooden buildings. Water had to be piped in from miles away. The Croton Aqueduct, completed in 1842, brought fresh water into Manhattan and helped curb some of the disease that plagued the poor. Gas lamps lit the streets. Horse-drawn omnibuses carried commuters uptown. Bridges connected the island to the mainland. But for every improvement, the city seemed to swell again, bursting at the seams with newcomers. And yet, for all its chaos, New York in this period was electric. The docks never slept. Sailors sang sea shanties under the moonlight. Newspapers shouted headlines on every corner. Churches rang with sermons in more languages than anyone could count. Beer flowed in German taverns. Violins cried in Irish dance halls. Factories whirred. Hammers rang. And out of it all, something new was forming. Not just a city, but a culture. Not English, not German, not Irish, not Dutch, but something uniquely New York. The energy of the place was contagious. Writers, artists, and thinkers arrived to capture it. Charles Dickens visited in 1842 and was both appalled and fascinated. He described the squalor of the 5 Points with horror, but couldn't ignore the vitality of the people who lived there. Outsiders saw disorder. Insiders saw opportunity. That tension between perception and reality defined the city. It was a place of soaring churches and rotting cellars, of opera houses and saloons, of literacy drives and child labor. It was impossible to pin down. For every story of misery, there was one of triumph. A shoeshine boy who learned to read, a widow who opened a bakery, a dock worker who sent his son to school. The city was brutal, but it didn't kill dreams. It forged them. And so, as the 1850s drew to a close, New York stood transformed. No longer just a former capital or a financial hub, it had become something larger, a gateway. It welcomed the world and forced it to adapt. It promised nothing, delivered little for free, and yet still, they came. Immigrants didn't just pass through New York, they made it. They laid its bricks, carried its burdens, filled its tenements, and shaped its soul. From the tenement windows, one could look out and see the city constantly building itself. an iron bridge being planned, a factory rising, a newspaper cart rolling down the street. There was smoke and stink and hardship. But also a heartbeat. New York had become an empire city not through conquest, but through absorption. It took people in by the hundreds, then thousands, then millions, and made them part of its machinery, its poetry, its momentum. This was the city at the edge of promise. Just ahead lay even more change, more railroads, more steel, more stories. But before any of that, in these decades of waves and whispers, the city had become something utterly new. A mosaic of humanity so dense, so loud, and so alive that no one, not even its own citizens, could truly define it. And perhaps that was the point. New York had been built, rebuilt, and now reborn. It was no longer the city of a single people or a single vision. It was a city of all people. And it was only just beginning. Chapter 7. Civil War and City Divided. By 1861, New York City had become the beating heart of American commerce, industry, and immigration. A place of steamships and factories, of towering ambition and grinding poverty. But beneath the surface of this empire city, a fracture was spreading. The nation was falling apart, and New York, despite its power and prestige, found itself deeply entangled in the chaos to come. When the first shots were fired at Fort Sumter, signaling the start of the Civil War, the country split in two. But New York split with itself. On paper, the city was part of the Union. It flew the stars and stripes, sent soldiers south, and supplied Abraham Lincoln's army with boots, blankets, and bullets. But the city's loyalties were not so simple. Many of its businessmen, especially those tied to Wall Street and shipping, had grown rich trading with the South. Cotton from southern plantations flowed through New York's harbor. Insurance companies covered slave ships. The city's banks had financed plantations and lent to southern merchants. The economic ties ran deep, and when secession came, many feared not just war, but financial collapse. At the same time, New York's working class, many of them recent immigrants from Ireland and Germany, felt no love for the abolitionist cause. These men lived in crowded tenements, worked dangerous jobs for low pay, and saw the elite waging war from a distance. To them, the fight to end slavery felt distant, even threatening. They worried that freed black men would come north and compete for their already meager jobs. They resented the wealthy who could buy their way out of service, and the politicians who seemed to value principles over people. Still, the city marched to war. Troops paraded down Broadway, cheered by crowds waving flags and throwing flowers. The 7th Regiment, one of the city's most elite units, was sent to protect Washington in the early days of the conflict. Ships were converted into war vessels. Foundries clanged with the sound of iron and steel. Wall Street buzzed with speculation as government contracts poured in. New York, reluctant or not, was going to profit from the war, and profit it did. War contracts turned factory owners into millionaires overnight. Textile mills churned out uniforms. Munitions factories ramped up production. Brokers traded government bonds and speculated on cotton futures. The city's financial sector grew fatter with every casualty report. Opportunists and conmen flourished. Contracts were sold, resold, and manipulated. Muskets were purchased that wouldn't fire. Boots fell apart in the field. Some men made fortunes selling goods to both sides of the war. Patriotism and profiteering walked hand in hand, often indistinguishable. But while money flowed uptown, unrest grew downtown. As the war dragged on and casualties mounted, support for Lincoln's cause began to fray. When Congress passed the Enrollment Act in 1863, requiring all men between the ages of 20 and 45 to register for the draft, it struck a nerve. The law allowed men to avoid service by paying a $300 commutation fee, a sum far beyond the reach of most laborers. To the city's poor, especially the Irish immigrants, who made up much of the working class, it felt like betrayal. It was a war they hadn't asked for, fought to free men who might soon become their competition, and they were being asked to bleed for it while the rich bought their way out. Anger turned to violence. On July 13, 1863, the city erupted. What began as a protest against the draft exploded into one of the worst urban uprisings in American history. Mobs of angry men stormed the draft offices, setting fire to the provost marshal's headquarters on 3rd Avenue. They tore up railway tracks, looted armories, and smashed the offices of Republican newspapers. Police were overwhelmed. Firefighters were attacked. The violence spread block by block, fueled by resentment, fear, and racial hatred. And then it turned on the black community. The draft riots, as they would come to be known, quickly devolved into a racist pogrom. Black men were hunted in the streets, beaten, lynched, their homes burned. The colored orphan asylum on 5th Avenue, a refuge for over 200 children, was set on fire by the mob. Miraculously, the children escaped, but the building was destroyed. Churches and schools connected to the black community were vandalized or burned. The message was clear and brutal. In the eyes of the mob, this war had nothing to do with justice. It was a threat to the very order they clung to. For 5 days, New York was a city at war with itself. The army had to be brought in. Veterans rushed up from Gettysburg to restore order. Soldiers fired on crowds. The streets ran red. By the time the violence ended, more than 100 people were dead. Thousands had been injured. The city's black population, already marginalized, was devastated. Many fled permanently, some moving to Brooklyn or New Jersey. Whole neighborhoods were changed overnight. It would take generations for the community to recover its presence in the city. And yet, the war continued. Despite the riots, despite the divisions, New York's importance to the Union only grew. It remained the North's economic engine. The port kept humming. The factories kept producing. New York banks underwrote government debt. The city sent more soldiers, more supplies, more money than any other in the Union. But it also carried the weight of contradiction. It profited from a war that tore families apart. It waved the flag of unity while struggling to keep its own streets from exploding. When Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863, the city's reaction was mixed at best. Abolitionists celebrated, but many business leaders and working-class whites saw it as a political ploy. Newspapers debated its legality. Wall Street speculated on its economic impact. For black New Yorkers, it was a moment of hope, but a fragile one, overshadowed by the violence that followed just months later. Emancipation had become law in the South, but in the streets of New York, freedom was still under siege. By the war's final year, the city was weary. The casualty lists were long. The political debates were bitter. But slowly, the tide turned. Sherman marched to the sea. Grant closed in on Richmond, and on April 9, 1865, the Confederacy surrendered. Days later, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. In New York, crowds gathered in silent mourning. The man many had doubted, mocked, and even hated had become a martyr. His body was brought through the city on a funeral train. Thousands lined the streets to watch it pass. black and white, rich and poor. They stood together in grief. The war had ended. The city had survived. But nothing would be quite the same. The Civil War had shaken New York to its core. It had revealed its deepest divisions between rich and poor, native and immigrant, white and black. It had exposed the price of hypocrisy and the limits of unity. But it had also reinforced the city's role as the engine of the nation. Through fire and riot, through corruption and courage, New York had held. It had grown, and it had changed. The skyline still bore scars. The tenements were more crowded than ever. The wounds of 1863 had not healed. But in the years ahead, the city would once again reinvent itself. It would absorb the lessons of war, the violence of unrest, and the hope of freedom. Because New York, for all its contradictions, never stopped moving forward. Chapter 8. Gilded Age Glory. When the smoke of the Civil War finally cleared and the wounded nation began to heal, New York City wasted no time in surging forward. The war had left behind shattered families, national scars, and economic uncertainty. But in the city, it had also left behind railroads, financial infrastructure, and ambition sharpened by conflict. The Gilded Age was beginning, and nowhere would it shine or glint so cruelly, as brightly as in New York. The city transformed rapidly, as if determined to erase the blood and smoke of the past with steel, speed, and style. Manhattan, once defined by its winding colonial lanes and wooden tenements, began to rise upward. The skyline stretched not with church steeples, but with buildings made of iron, brick, and eventually steel. These were the early skyscrapers, 10, 12, sometimes even 20 stories tall, made possible by the elevator and the skeleton frame construction. To walk down Broadway in the 1880s was to walk through a canyon of ambition. The streets teemed with people. Horses clattered, streetcars rattled. The world felt faster every day, and New York was its capital. Behind much of this explosive growth stood a new kind of American royalty, the industrial titans. They weren't kings, but they ruled all the same. Men like John D. Rockefeller, Cornelius Vanderbilt, and Andrew Carnegie reshaped not only the city, but the country. They were visionaries, monopolists, philanthropists, and, in the eyes of many, robber barons. Their empires weren't built on land or inheritance, but on oil, steel, and railroads, and their wealth was staggering. Cornelius Vanderbilt, known as the Commodore, had started in shipping but turned his attention to railroads after the war. He understood that whoever controlled the tracks controlled the flow of goods and the money. His New York Central Railroad stretched across the Northeast, linking city to city, port to factory, coast to heartland. In Manhattan, he funded the construction of Grand Central Depot, a sprawling terminal that would later become Grand Central Station. His name was etched into buildings, businesses, and even universities. He was both admired and feared. John D. Rockefeller rose through oil. His Standard Oil Company, headquartered in New York, controlled nearly all oil refining in the United States by the 1880s. He mastered the game of consolidation, buying out competitors, lowering prices, undercutting rivals. His methods were ruthless, his discipline legendary. From his office in Lower Manhattan, he orchestrated a corporate empire that touched nearly every household in the country. And though he gave away much of his fortune later in life, during the Gilded Age, Rockefeller represented the unstoppable logic of capital. Andrew Carnegie, though based primarily in Pittsburgh, kept close ties to New York's financial world. His steel fed the city's vertical dreams. His gospel of wealth encouraged the rich to give back, but only after winning the economic war. And he, like his peers, treated business like a battlefield. As these men amassed fortunes, they built more than companies. They shaped the skyline. Libraries, museums, universities, all funded by the fortunes of industry, began to rise across the city. The Metropolitan Museum of Art opened its doors. The New York Public Library began to grow. Philanthropy became both a moral mission and a branding tool for the elite. To walk through Manhattan's grand avenues was to witness power made visible in stone and glass. And yet, for every tower that touched the sky, there were 100 homes where sunlight never reached. While the city's upper crust dined in Fifth Avenue mansions, the urban poor struggled in the squalor of tenements. Immigrants continued to pour in from Europe, more than 1 million between 1870 and 1900. They came for work, but the work was brutal. They labored in sweatshops and slaughterhouses, in steel mills and on the docks. Children worked alongside parents. Accidents were common, wages were low, rent was high. In the Lower East Side, entire families lived in single rooms. Hallways stank of sewage. Illness spread fast. The slums of New York grew denser by the year, with buildings stacked upon buildings, each crammed to capacity. The contrast was dizzying. Uptown, women in silk gloves strolled through Central Park, a manicured paradise designed by Frederick Law Olmsted and Calvert Vaux to provide green refuge for a crowded city. Downtown, mothers lined up at public water pumps to fill rusted buckets. Uptown, carriages rolled past brownstone mansions. Downtown, barefoot children chased rats through alleys. It was one city, but two lives. And yet, even among the poor, there was pride. There were unions and clubs, newspapers in every language, schools teaching children whose parents had never held a book. The Jewish tailors of the Lower East Side, the Italian stonecutters, the Chinese launderers, the German bakers, all built communities in the shadows of the rich. They formed orchestras and societies, held parades and funerals, passed down language and tradition. The melting pot was not yet molten, but the fire had been lit. Labor unrest followed. In 1877, the Great Railroad Strike spread to New York. And though it was less violent here than elsewhere, the message was clear. Workers had begun to organize. Socialists and anarchists held meetings in back rooms and beer halls. Newspapers like The Sun and The World printed exposés of factory conditions. Reformers like Jacob Riis would later photograph the tenements, publishing How the Other Half Lives and shocking the comfortable classes into momentary awareness. But change came slowly. Still, the city's hunger could not be stopped. The Brooklyn Bridge, begun in 1870 and completed in 1883, symbolized this age of ambition. It connected Manhattan to Brooklyn, tying together two of the world's largest cities and standing as a marvel of engineering. Designed by John Roebling and completed by his son Washington, who directed the project bedridden after contracting the bends during construction, the bridge became an emblem of what New York could do when steel, sweat, and vision combined. Above the streets, elevated railways began to snake through the city, carrying commuters to jobs and shoppers to department stores. Beneath the surface, plans were underway for what would eventually become the subway. The city buzzed with invention. Thomas Edison opened his first power plant on Pearl Street in 1882, lighting a square mile of Lower Manhattan. The age of electricity had arrived. Politics continued to churn. Tammany Hall still ruled the city's democratic machine, now under men like Richard Croker. Corruption was endemic. But the machine delivered services the city government often couldn't. Coal in winter, jobs in summer, burial plots when the end came too early. Reformers pushed back, demanding clean governance and transparency. But Tammany's grip remained strong. And all the while, the divide between rich and poor grew wider. The wealth of the elite became a spectacle. Newspapers breathlessly reported on millionaire weddings, transatlantic cruises, and marble staircases. The Gilded Age, named not for pure gold, but for a thin layer of glitter covering rot, was in full swing. It was an age of contradictions. Wealth beyond imagination and poverty that seemed medieval. Unprecedented invention and unrelenting exploitation. Philanthropy and inequality living side by side. And through it all, New York did what it always did. It absorbed, it adapted, and it pressed forward. By the turn of the century, it was clear that the city was becoming something new again. Not just the largest city in America, but a global capital. The skyline hinted at what was to come. The people, crowded, diverse, and driven, were already shaping the next chapter. And though the Gilded Age had made millionaires of a few, it had made New York into something far more powerful. The city where dreams, for better or worse, came to live or die. Chapter 9. Immigrants, Labor, and Innovation. As the 20th century dawned, New York stood at the threshold of transformation once again. The steel and smoke of the Gilded Age had reshaped its skyline, and now the human tide surged in to fill its streets. The city had always been a destination for the desperate and the daring. But never before had the scale been so massive or the diversity so staggering. Between 1900 and 1930, New York was not just a city, it was a continent in miniature. At the heart of this new migration stood Ellis Island. The old fortress at the mouth of the Hudson had become the main gateway for millions. From 1900 until the mid-1920s, more than 12 million immigrants passed through its great halls. They arrived on steamships, weary and anxious, clutching battered suitcases and the names of cousins scribbled on crumpled scraps of paper. Most had little more than calloused hands and faith that America would be better than whatever they had left behind. They came from southern Italy, fleeing poverty and drought. From the Russian Empire, escaping pogroms and political persecution. From Poland, Hungary, Lithuania, and Ukraine. Many were Jews pushed out by the rising tides of anti-Semitism. Others were Catholic, Orthodox, or no religion at all. They spoke dozens of languages, dressed in unfamiliar clothes, and carried customs foreign to the Yankee establishment that still clung to the upper echelons of power. The processing at Ellis Island was fast, but terrifying. Doctors checked for signs of illness, trachoma, tuberculosis, mental instability. Inspectors asked pointed questions. Do you have work? Can you read? Who paid your passage? A chalk mark on your coat could mean extra screening. A wrong answer might send you back across the ocean. But for the vast majority, the gates opened, and the journey truly began. They poured into neighborhoods like the Lower East Side, Little Italy, and Williamsburg. They moved into tenements that were already crowded, stacking families on top of each other, floor by floor, block by block. Streets became rivers of noise and color. Push carts lined the sidewalks, selling pickles, bread, buttons, and books. Children ran barefoot, dodging trolley cars and playing stickball. Mothers scrubbed laundry in bathtubs. Fathers left before dawn to work in factories that barely knew sunlight. The city throbbed with motion. Work was the reason they came, and work was what they found. But the jobs were hard, the pay was low, and the conditions were often brutal. The garment industry dominated, particularly for Jewish and Italian women, who spent 10, 12, sometimes 14 hours a day hunched over sewing machines in stifling sweatshops. They stitched shirtwaists, trousers, collars, and dresses. Millions of garments churned out for America's middle class by hands that barely made enough to survive. Wages were so low that entire families worked. Children as young as 8 were sent to factories. Many never learned to read. Others attended night school after working full days. Some lost fingers, limbs, or their lives to unsafe machines and unguarded floors. There were no safety nets, no unions with teeth, at least not yet. But the injustice did not go unchallenged. As the city swelled, a new kind of consciousness began to take root. Labor movements organized workers who barely shared a common language, but shared the same tired eyes and aching backs. Socialist thinkers, anarchist speakers, unionists, and reformers met in synagogue basements, Italian cafes, and Polish newspaper offices. They debated tactics. They translated pamphlets. They staged strikes. In 1909, the uprising of the 20,000 saw mostly Jewish women garment workers walk off the job in protest. It was one of the largest female-led strikes in American history. But it took tragedy to ignite real change. On March 25, 1911, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, located on the top 3 floors of the Ash Building in Greenwich Village, caught fire. Inside were mostly immigrant girls, some as young as 14, sewing shirtwaists under terrible conditions. When the flames erupted, they had nowhere to go. The doors were locked to prevent theft. The fire escape collapsed. In desperation, workers leapt from the windows, smashing onto the pavement below as crowds watched in horror. By the time the fire was out, 146 people were dead. The public outrage was immediate. The city had witnessed plenty of death, but this was something different. These were not nameless casualties. These were daughters and sisters, workers and neighbors. The tragedy became a rallying cry. Laws changed, inspections increased, labor unions gained support. And though exploitation would never disappear, a line had been drawn in ash and blood. Even as reform stirred, the city's cultural pulse quickened. The 1910s and 1920s brought an explosion of creativity that reshaped New York and echoed across the nation. In Harlem, Black musicians, poets, and thinkers launched what would be called the Harlem Renaissance. The children and grandchildren of slaves, many of whom had fled the South during the Great Migration, now filled the blocks north of 125th Street with music and meaning. Jazz floated from clubs like the Cotton Club and the Savoy Ballroom. Langston Hughes wrote poems that captured the beauty and pain of Black life. Zora Neale Hurston told stories rooted in Southern folklore, but born anew in the northern metropolis. It was a moment of brilliance forged in the crucible of struggle. Downtown, the bohemian spirit took root. Greenwich Village attracted artists, anarchists, and dreamers. Cafes filled with painters and playwrights arguing over philosophy. The modern art movement began to find footing in America, with New York as its stage. Painters like Edward Hopper captured the loneliness of urban life. Immigrant writers like Anzia Jezierska told stories of girls who had survived the sweatshops and now chased something more. In theaters, new voices emerged. The Yiddish theater thrived on 2nd Avenue, known as the Yiddish Broadway. Jewish actors and playwrights entertained packed houses with dramas and comedies drawn from old world traditions and new world anxieties. It was in these packed halls that generations first heard the sound of their own stories told in their own accents. And above it all, the city continued to climb. The Woolworth Building pierced the sky in 1913, dubbed the Cathedral of Commerce. At 792 feet, it was the tallest building in the world at the time, a Gothic spire that symbolized ambition and the triumph of steel. New York was not just growing, it was transforming into the archetype of the modern metropolis. The subway system expanded beneath the streets, carrying millions each day. Grand Central Terminal opened in 1913, a temple to motion, light, and marble. Fifth Avenue bloomed with department stores, where immigrant daughters who once stitched shirtwaists now dreamed of buying them. The city was not just a place to survive anymore. It was a place to strive. Prohibition arrived in 1920, making the manufacture and sale of alcohol illegal. But New York, with its endless appetite, found ways around it. Speakeasies flourished, hidden behind false doors and guarded by passwords. Gangsters like Arnold Rothstein made fortunes in vice. Jazz and gin flowed side by side. The Roaring Twenties had arrived, and New York roared the loudest. Yet the contradictions endured. For every millionaire who danced at the Waldorf, there were 100 laborers working double shifts. For every penthouse on Park Avenue, there were 1,000 cold water flats in the Bronx. But the city no longer hid these truths. It wore them. It embraced them. It built a culture around them. By the end of the 1920s, New York was no longer merely a city of immigrants or industry. It had become the face of America to the world, a mosaic of language, labor, and culture, a metropolis of extremes, of poverty and promise, injustice and innovation. It had grown again, not by accident, but by desire. The people who had arrived through Ellis Island had not merely settled. They had reshaped. And in doing so, they made New York something it had never been before. Not just the biggest city in America, but the symbol of its restless, relentless soul. Chapter 10: The Great Depression and World War II. The 1920s had ended with champagne in the air and jazz on every corner. New York sparkled with the illusion of endless growth, endless wealth, and endless motion. But illusions crack easily, and when they shatter, they leave behind silence. On October 24th, 1929, Black Thursday, the illusion burst. Crowds gathered outside the New York Stock Exchange, eyes fixed on the windows, ears straining for news. Panic spread like fire. 4 days later, on Black Monday, and then again on Black Tuesday, the market collapsed. The age of prosperity was over, and the age of survival had begun. Wall Street, once a temple of confidence, became the epicenter of fear. Fortunes evaporated overnight. Brokers wept at their desks. Rumors of suicides, some real and some exaggerated, spread like ash on the wind. But the devastation didn't stop with the traders. It rolled outward, into factories, shops, banks, homes. Businesses closed, loans defaulted, savings accounts vanished, jobs disappeared by the hundreds of thousands. New York, the financial heart of the nation, was now the face of its suffering. By 1932, nearly 1 in 3 workers in the city was unemployed. Bread lines wrapped around blocks. Men in worn-out coats stood in silence, waiting for soup or a crust of bread. Children picked through trash for coal. Families were evicted in waves, forced into makeshift camps of tents and scrap wood. These shanty towns, sarcastically dubbed Hoovervilles, after President Herbert Hoover, rose in Central Park and along the rivers. Their presence was a symbol of abandonment and of defiance. The city government struggled to respond. Charity was overwhelmed. Tammany Hall, long the master of patronage, couldn't feed everyone. Even the churches and synagogues ran dry. Protests began to erupt. Unemployed councils marched on City Hall. Veterans demanded their promised bonuses. Police cracked down. But the desperation only deepened. And yet, in the middle of this despair, something else began to stir, a new kind of politics, one rooted not in nostalgia or wealth, but in action. In 1932, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the governor of New York and a man shaped by both privilege and polio, was elected President of the United States. He promised a New Deal for the American people. And nowhere would that deal matter more than in New York City. FDR's programs arrived like lifeboats in a flood. Federal money poured into the city, not just to feed and clothe, but to build. The Works Progress Administration hired thousands of artists, writers, and laborers. Murals appeared on school walls. Roads and bridges were repaired. Parks were cleaned and restored. The Civilian Conservation Corps sent young men into upstate forests. The Public Works Administration financed vast infrastructure. Bridges, tunnels, hospitals, schools. One of the boldest figures in this wave of transformation was Robert Moses. Armed with federal funds, he launched a sweeping program of urban renewal. Parks were expanded, public pools were built, highways carved through old neighborhoods. His vision was grand and often ruthless. He displaced the poor to make room for cars and concrete. His legacy would become controversial, but in those years, he helped reshape a broken city into something functional, even hopeful. The skyline began to rise again, as if daring the economy to hold it back. The Empire State Building, begun during the boom, was completed in 1931. At first, it was called the Empty State Building. So few tenants could afford its space. But it stood as a symbol of persistence. The Rockefeller Center project, funded privately and completed during the depths of the Depression, created thousands of jobs. Its Art Deco towers, murals, and skating rink would become icons of the city's spirit. Still, recovery was slow. Not everyone found work. Racial and ethnic minorities suffered most. Black New Yorkers were often the last hired and the first fired. Immigrants were scapegoated once again. But culture, as always, pressed forward. The 1930s saw a golden age of film, theater, and radio. Broadway remained alive, sometimes barely. The Apollo Theater in Harlem continued to showcase jazz, gospel, and blues. New York became the voice of a nation on the radio, as news, comedy, and music flowed from the city to every corner of the country. In literature, writers captured the pain and resilience of the age. John Steinbeck, though more associated with California, passed through New York and met editors who would publish his greatest works. Thomas Wolfe wrote sweeping novels from his apartment in the city. Langston Hughes continued to write poetry that reflected the rhythms of Harlem and the heartbreak of poverty. The newspapers chronicled it all. The New York Times, the Daily News, and the Post delivered a daily mix of scandal, survival, and spectacle. The tabloids ran photos of evictions one day and society balls the next. The contradiction was ever present. Riches clinking in cocktail glasses, while children froze 2 blocks away. As the 1930s gave way to a new decade, the clouds of war began to gather again. Not from within, but from across the sea. Europe trembled as fascism rose. Hitler marched into Poland. London braced for bombs. New York watched, at first from a distance. Isolationist sentiment ran high, but beneath the surface, the city was already preparing. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, and the United States entered World War II, New York transformed almost overnight. The Depression didn't end through policy alone. It ended with war. The city became a machine of production and coordination. Shipyards roared back to life. The Brooklyn Navy Yard worked around the clock, building warships. Factories retooled to make uniforms, bullets, engines. Women took the jobs men had left behind. Posters went up urging New Yorkers to buy war bonds, to plant victory gardens, to stay silent and vigilant. The city pulsed with patriotic energy. Soldiers shipped out from Penn Station, waving to sweethearts and clutching letters in their coat pockets. Families hung blue stars in windows for loved ones serving overseas. Gold stars meant someone wouldn't be coming home. The rationing began. Meat, sugar, rubber. But the people endured. Sacrifice had become part of daily life. The war also brought an influx of intelligence and diplomacy. Refugees from Europe, scientists, artists, and intellectuals, made New York their temporary home. The city became a haven for ideas. Albert Einstein walked its streets. Artists like Marc Chagall and Piet Mondrian painted from small apartments. The city, which had once looked to Paris for inspiration, now became the cultural capital of the Western world. Entertainment reflected the moment. Big bands played at the Roseland Ballroom. Frank Sinatra's voice echoed through radios. Movies played to packed theaters, stories of courage, loss, and victory. Even in blackouts, the city found ways to shine. But not everything was noble. Japanese Americans on the West Coast were sent to internment camps. Though fewer lived in New York, anti-Japanese sentiment reached the city's papers and politics. Civil liberties bent under the pressure of fear. Black Americans who had come north for factory jobs still faced discrimination and exclusion. The promise of equality, so often spoken in wartime speeches, remained a distant hope for many. Still, the city endured, and as the war dragged on, the scale of its commitment only grew. By 1945, New York had become the logistical heart of the American war effort. It processed more military cargo than any other city. It raised more in war bonds. It sent more letters overseas, more care packages, more prayers. And when victory finally came, first in Europe, then in the Pacific, the celebration poured into the streets. On August 14th, 1945, the news broke. Japan had surrendered. It was VJ Day. In Times Square, crowds surged. Sailors kissed strangers. Confetti fell from windows like snow. The city that had suffered through depression, that had armed a nation, that had said farewell to hundreds of thousands, finally exhaled. The war was over. The city had changed. So had the world. New York emerged from the Second World War stronger, richer, more powerful than ever before. Its skyline was taller. Its population had grown past 7 million. Its culture had spread around the globe. It had endured the greatest economic collapse in its history and the most devastating war humanity had ever seen. And still it stood. No longer just America's city, but the city. It had not escaped the scars. Poverty, inequality, and prejudice remained. But something had been forged in those hard years. The city had found a new voice, a louder rhythm, a deeper strength. And it would carry that forward into the uncertainty, the prosperity, and the turmoil of a new post-war world. Chapter 11. The Post-War Boom. The guns had fallen silent. The bombs had stopped falling. The soldiers were coming home. When World War II ended in 1945, New York stood not only unbroken, but triumphant. Its factories had powered the arsenal of democracy. Its ports had shipped the supplies of war. Its streets had swelled with the determination of a nation at arms. Now, in victory, the city turned inward to rebuild lives, to rediscover peacetime, and to dream even bigger dreams. They came home in waves. Veterans returning from France, from the Pacific, from North Africa. Boys who had left in uniforms now stood on subway platforms in civilian clothes, searching for apartments, jobs, and a future. The GI Bill offered college tuition, mortgages, and a new kind of promise. For the first time, millions of Americans could afford a piece of the American dream. In New York, that dream took on concrete form. There was hardly enough space. The city had grown during the war, but housing hadn't kept pace. Families doubled up in small apartments. Attics were turned into bedrooms. Living rooms became nurseries. But the shortage spurred a building frenzy. In the outer boroughs, in Queens, the Bronx, Brooklyn, new developments sprang up seemingly overnight. Rows of brick buildings, garden apartments, and middle-income co-ops redefined the idea of home. They were modest but modern, efficient and bright, tailored for the returning soldier and his growing family. The great suburban tide was also beginning to rise. Just outside city limits, in Nassau and Westchester counties, farmland gave way to neatly gridded subdivisions. Long Island, once a string of sleepy towns and potato fields, became the testing ground for mass-produced living. Levittown, the most famous of these developments, offered homes to veterans for as little as $7,000. The houses were nearly identical. Cape Cod style, one story, with a white picket fence and a front lawn. But to many, they represented a future free from war, poverty, and overcrowding. This was the birth of the modern American middle class, and New York was its engine. Jobs were plentiful. Wages were rising. The factories that once built tanks and planes now churned out refrigerators and radios. Department stores like Macy's and Gimbel's overflowed with consumer goods. The city sparkled again, not just with wealth, but with optimism. The skyline kept climbing. In Midtown, the United Nations broke ground on its gleaming new headquarters in 1947. A striking glass and steel complex that would house diplomats from every corner of the globe. New York, once a colonial outpost, was now the capital of international diplomacy. Flags of all nations fluttered along First Avenue. The world was welcome, but always on the city's terms. Underneath the surface, the subway system expanded to keep up with the booming population. The IND lines stretched deeper into Queens and Brooklyn. Trains grew more crowded, schedules tighter. Millions now relied on the subway each day. Commuters from the Bronx, mothers with strollers in Flatbush, businessmen in Trilby hats headed downtown. The city's veins pulsed with motion. Above ground, another revolution was underway. Highways. Robert Moses, still the city's most powerful builder, continued his relentless reshaping of New York. He built bridges and tunnels, expressways and parkways. The Cross Bronx Expressway slashed through working-class neighborhoods, displacing thousands. The BQE carved through Brooklyn. The Long Island Expressway opened up the suburbs to mass migration. Moses believed in the car, in speed, in concrete, and he had the political muscle to make his vision real. But the costs were high. Neighborhoods were split, parks were destroyed. Communities, especially poor and minority ones, were shattered. Resistance began to stir, but it would take decades before Moses's power was truly challenged. For now, he seemed unstoppable, a man who could draw a line on a map and bulldoze whatever stood in his way. As the 1950s rolled into the 1960s, the city grew wealthier, but also more divided. Prosperity flowed unevenly. The new middle class, largely white, fled the inner city for the suburbs, aided by federal loans and redlining policies that kept Black and Latino families out. Entire neighborhoods were denied mortgages based on race. Banks, developers, and government agencies worked together, sometimes explicitly, sometimes quietly, to shape a segregated metropolis. In Harlem, in Bed-Stuy, in the South Bronx, the signs were clear. Schools were overcrowded. Playgrounds were neglected. Housing was old, unsafe, and often rat-infested. Garbage collection was sporadic. Opportunities were limited. And yet, in these neighborhoods, culture flourished. Jazz clubs still lit up the Harlem nights. Baptist churches thundered with gospel. Local businesses thrived in the face of neglect. Families supported each other. But resentment was building. So were expectations. Elsewhere, the boom continued. Wall Street soared again. The television industry blossomed, centered around Rockefeller Plaza and the new studios springing up in Midtown. Madison Avenue became synonymous with advertising, slick, powerful, and persuasive. New York's cultural output fed the world. Broadway musicals, best-selling novels, magazine journalism, everything passed through the city's hands. At the same time, new waves of immigrants were arriving, this time from Puerto Rico, the Dominican Republic, and later from other parts of Latin America and the Caribbean. Puerto Ricans, in particular, came in huge numbers after air travel became affordable. Many settled in East Harlem, El Barrio, and the South Bronx. They brought music, food, language, and labor. But they also faced discrimination, poor housing, and underfunded schools. The promise of New York came with conditions, and not everyone was told the terms. Meanwhile, the city's identity was shifting. The melting pot was bubbling, but it was also stratifying. Black and brown communities were growing, asserting themselves, demanding space, both literal and cultural. But the structures of power remained mostly white, mostly male, mostly resistant to change. Still, there were moments of unity. The Dodgers, based in Brooklyn, became a symbol of working-class pride. Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier in 1947, and though he faced vicious racism, he became a hero for fans across the city. Baseball bound people together, at least for 9 innings. Public housing expanded to meet the growing demand. The city built massive complexes: Red Hook houses, Queensbridge, the Bronx River houses. They were meant to be clean, modern alternatives to the slums. But over time, they became isolated, underfunded, and stigmatized. What began as hope slowly turned into containment. Throughout it all, New York never stopped moving. Crowds surged through Grand Central. Taxi horns blared. Newsboys shouted headlines about the Cold War, about Korea, about Sputnik. Couples danced to Sinatra. Beat poets drank coffee in Greenwich Village. Everything was urgent, everything in flux. And under the surface, the seeds of unrest had begun to sprout. Disparities in housing, education, and policing were becoming harder to ignore. Activists started organizing. Civil rights protests in the South inspired action in the North. Harlem simmered. The Bronx grew impatient. The city seemed prosperous from above, but down on the ground, many knew the reckoning would come. For now, though, the boom rolled on. Television sets flickered in tenements and penthouses alike. Children played stickball in the streets of Queens. Families gathered on stoops. The lights of Times Square dazzled tourists. The skyline rose higher, more confident. The city was loud, proud, and certain of its place in the world. New York had emerged from the war with swagger, had embraced the post-war dream with both arms. But it was a city of contradictions, of progress and exclusion, of unity and division. And as the 1960s approached, it faced a new question. How long could it keep both faces turned toward the future without first confronting the realities beneath its own feet? Chapter 12. Decline, Crime, and Resilience. The promise of post-war New York had shimmered brightly, but by the mid-1960s, the light began to flicker. Beneath the polished glass of new skyscrapers and the hum of television commercials lay a city in slow decay. What had once felt like forward momentum now began to feel like free fall. The signs were everywhere. On the streets, in the schools, in the emptying neighborhoods. New York was still the capital of culture, commerce, and dreams. But those dreams were becoming harder to hold. White flight was already underway. Middle-class families, mostly white, had taken advantage of highways and federal home loans to leave the city for the promise of the suburbs. Out in Long Island and Westchester, they found tidy lawns and new schools. Back in the city, their absence left behind crumbling buildings, empty storefronts, and a shrinking tax base. As wealth flowed out, disinvestment took root, city services faltered, garbage collection became unreliable. Schools were overcrowded and underfunded. Entire neighborhoods, especially in the Bronx, Brooklyn, and Harlem, were left behind. At the same time, crime began to rise. The reasons were many: poverty, addiction, broken families, systemic neglect. But the result was fear. Streets that had once been alive with possibility now felt dangerous. The subways were covered in graffiti, their cars tagged in thick black ink and multicolored spray paint. At first it was dismissed as vandalism, then feared as the mark of lawlessness, and eventually, paradoxically, celebrated as a form of resistance and art. Drugs flooded the city. Heroin in the 1970s, crack cocaine by the 1980s. Addiction hollowed out lives and families. Shootings spiked. The murder rate soared. Police patrols grew heavier, more aggressive, more distrusted. The war on crime blurred into a war on communities. In some neighborhoods, young men disappeared into prisons at staggering rates. In others, arson became a desperate tool. Landlords torching their own buildings for insurance, or tenants setting fire to what no longer felt like home. Nowhere were the flames more visible than in the Bronx. Once a proud borough of working-class families, it became a national symbol of urban collapse. By the late 1970s, entire blocks were abandoned. Apartment buildings stood hollowed out, their windows shattered, walls scorched black. Firehouses were closed due to budget cuts. When residents called for help, no one came. Journalists captured the horror in headlines. The Bronx is burning. It wasn't just metaphor, it was literal. Each night, flames lit the skyline, fueled by despair and neglect. In 1977, a massive blackout struck the city. Lightning hit a power line north of the city, and within hours, New York went dark. Subways ground to a halt, elevators froze between floors, and in some neighborhoods, especially the poorest, chaos followed. Looting spread through Crown Heights, Harlem, the South Bronx. Shops were emptied, windows smashed, fires lit. Police, overwhelmed and disorganized, struggled to respond. When the lights finally came back on, over 1,600 stores had been looted, and more than 1,000 fires had burned. The blackout revealed what many already knew. The city was broken, and it wasn't being fixed. Amid the wreckage, Times Square fell into its own kind of darkness. Once the glittering crossroads of the world, it became the city's seediest corner. Porn theaters, peep shows, strip clubs, and drug dealers took over block after block. Prostitutes lined 42nd Street. Theaters that once hosted Broadway dreams now flickered with XXX signs. Tourists still came, but they came warily, clutching their bags, looking over their shoulders. Even New Yorkers avoided the area unless they had no choice. And yet, in the corners of collapse, something remarkable began to stir. In the South Bronx, amid burned-out buildings and concrete playgrounds, a new sound emerged. It wasn't planned. It wasn't funded. It came from turntables, from street corners, from block parties lit by extension cords and powered by car batteries. DJs looped breakbeats from funk records. MCs rhymed over the rhythm. B-boys danced like lightning across linoleum floors. Graffiti artists left their mark on trains and walls, and hip-hop was born. It wasn't just music. It was a culture, a form of expression born out of exclusion, frustration, and raw creativity. Kids with no money made art with what they had. Speakers became instruments. Rhymes became protest. In the shadow of ruin, something new was being built, not with bricks, but with beats. While the mainstream ignored it at first, hip-hop couldn't be contained. It spread from block to block, borough to borough. DJ Kool Herc, Grandmaster Flash, Africa Bamba Eta, they were the pioneers. Their names whispered through the streets and then shouted through cassette tapes. What had begun as neighborhood survival soon became a global movement. The Bronx, once a symbol of destruction, was now a birthplace of revolution. In Brooklyn, too, artists pushed back. Spike Lee began making films that captured the joy and anger of black life in Bed-Stuy. Jean-Michel Basquiat, born in Brooklyn to Haitian and Puerto Rican parents, became the city's most electrifying young artist, tagging the streets with cryptic poetry before painting canvases that would one day hang in the world's greatest museums. His work was chaotic, brilliant, tragic, like the city itself. And even Times Square, drowning in sleaze, became a site of strange creativity. The punk scene emerged downtown, loud, ragged, defiant. Bands like the Ramones, Television, and Talking Heads played CBGBs, a grimy club on the Bowery that became a shrine to nonconformity. The Velvet Underground had already rewritten rock music. Now, downtown New York was rewriting it again, louder, weirder, and with no interest in pleasing anyone. Still, the city was hemorrhaging money. By 1975, New York was teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. Years of mismanagement, debt, and economic downturn had brought the city to its knees. The government appealed to Washington for help. President Gerald Ford refused. The Daily News responded with a now legendary headline, "Ford to City, Drop Dead." The threat of collapse was real. Municipal workers went unpaid. Schools and hospitals braced for closures. Subway cars, covered in graffiti and rust, broke down daily. Garbage piled up in the streets. The once proud city seemed to be rotting from the inside. But somehow, it didn't die. It staggered, it limped, it shouted, but it didn't stop. Artists kept painting. Musicians kept playing. Families kept going to work, to school, to church. Communities organized, marched, demanded change. New York had always been loud, and now that noise was survival. And then, slowly, the city began to claw its way back. Federal loans eventually stabilized the economy. New mayors, some more competent than others, tried to reform city government. Police strategies changed. Business leaders stepped in to help save the subway system. Wall Street, nearly forgotten during the worst of the chaos, began to rally again in the 1980s, bringing wealth back to the city, even if it remained mostly concentrated at the top. By the end of the 1980s, Times Square was still grimy, the Bronx was still struggling, and inequality remained sky-high. But there were signs of life everywhere. Off-Broadway theaters thrived. Hip-hop had gone global. Artists were selling out galleries. Books and essays poured out of New York writers. The city had survived the storm, not unscathed, not unchanged, but still standing. The fire hadn't just destroyed. It had also revealed what could not be burned away: the resilience, the creativity, the chaos, and the hunger that had always defined New York. The city didn't apologize for its pain. It wore it. And somewhere in that defiance, it began to believe in itself again. Chapter 13. The Big Rebound. The scars of the 1970s and 80s were still fresh, but as the 1990s began, New York City stood at the edge of yet another transformation. The fires had quieted. The headlines of bankruptcy, blackouts, and bombed-out buildings had faded from the front pages. Something new was in the air. Not just recovery, but ambition. The city, bruised and wild for so long, was beginning to believe in itself again. And for the first time in a generation, that belief was backed by money. Wall Street led the way. The financial sector, long the quiet machinery behind New York's economy, exploded into full force in the 1990s. The bull market charged through the decade, powered by deregulation, globalization, and, by the mid-90s, the dot-com boom. Investment banks, hedge funds, and private equity firms made astronomical profits. Young traders in tailored suits crowded the floor of the New York Stock Exchange, their voices filling the air with urgency. Stock options minted millionaires overnight. A new culture of finance swaggered through downtown Manhattan, confident, aggressive, hungry. With wealth came glass and steel. The skyline, long defined by the Empire State and the Chrysler, began to sprout new towers. Battery Park City, built on landfill from the construction of the World Trade Center, transformed into a sleek neighborhood of high-rise condos and waterfront parks. Midtown saw a wave of new office towers and luxury residences. In Soho, cast-iron warehouses were converted into sprawling lofts with minimalist furniture and million-dollar views. But prosperity didn't reach everyone. While investment bankers toasted champagne downtown, many outer borough neighborhoods were still recovering from decades of neglect. The South Bronx, East New York, and parts of Harlem remained stuck between past and future, riddled with poverty, but beginning to change. That change came with a price. In the early 1990s, New York still felt dangerous. Crime rates remained high. Murders, robberies, carjackings. The city was known as much for fear as it was for fashion. Parents warned their children not to ride the subway after dark. Tourists clutched their purses in Times Square. Businesses hesitated to invest in neighborhoods seen as unsafe. For all its creative energy, New York still felt like a gamble. Into this atmosphere stepped Rudolph Giuliani. A former federal prosecutor known for taking down mobsters, Giuliani ran for mayor promising order, safety, and discipline. He won in 1993, and he wasted no time. His administration declared war on crime, with a new philosophy and a new strategy. The NYPD adopted broken windows policing, the theory that cracking down on small offenses, graffiti, turnstile jumping, loitering, would prevent larger crimes. Officers flooded the streets. Stop-and-frisk tactics increased. Arrests surged. At the same time, CompStat was introduced, a data-driven crime tracking system that allowed police commanders to track incidents block by block in real time. Crime statistics were posted publicly. Precinct captains were held accountable for results. The NYPD became a numbers machine, targeting hot spots, coordinating sweeps, and measuring success in weekly meetings with maps and charts. The results were undeniable. From 1990 to 2000, major crime in New York dropped by more than 60%. Murders, which had peaked at over 2,200 in 1990, fell to under 700 by the end of the decade. The subways felt safer. Tourists returned in droves. Corporations reinvested in neighborhoods they had once abandoned. Property values rose. Businesses opened. And for many New Yorkers, the change felt like a miracle. But it came with a shadow. The aggressive policing tactics disproportionately targeted Black and Latino communities. Stop and frisk stopped hundreds of thousands of people each year, the vast majority of whom were never charged with a crime. Entire neighborhoods lived under constant surveillance. Trust between the police and the communities they served fractured further. Civil rights groups protested. Lawsuits were filed. But the administration pushed forward, confident that public safety justified the means. Meanwhile, the city's prosperity deepened. The economy boomed, restaurants buzzed, celebrities walked the streets without entourages. New York felt like the center of the world again. The stock market made headlines daily. Real estate prices climbed steadily. Even Times Square, long the symbol of urban decay, was cleaned up and repackaged. The peep shows and pawn shops were replaced with Disney stores and chain restaurants. Giant LED screens replaced neon signs. Tourists posed with costumed characters. The transformation was dramatic and controversial. Some hailed it as a triumph of civic order. Others mourned the loss of grit, of authenticity, of old New York. The transformation wasn't limited to Manhattan. In Brooklyn, neighborhoods like Park Slope, Williamsburg, and Fort Greene began to gentrify rapidly. Young professionals, artists, and students moved into areas once considered dangerous. Rents rose. Coffee shops replaced bodegas. Longtime residents found themselves priced out of their own communities. The city's cultural geography shifted. What was once a city of neighborhoods began to feel, in some places, like a series of branded enclaves. This was the paradox of New York in the 1990s. A city getting safer, richer, and more globally influential, while also growing more unequal, more segregated, and more controlled. The subway, once a place of chaos, now ran more efficiently, but also more predictably. Fare evasion was no longer a winked-at offense. It could lead to jail time. Panhandlers were pushed out. Homelessness remained. But the response had changed. The streets were cleaner. The rules were tighter. The margins were thinner. And yet, for many, this was the golden era. The music scene thrived, hip-hop still evolving, and produced legends like Nas and the notorious B.I.G., whose lyrics captured both the pain and pride of life in Brooklyn. Indie rock grew in the shadow of the Lower East Side. Visual artists found cheap studios in outer boroughs. The internet was new and raw, but New York quickly became a digital hub. Startups opened in Soho lofts. Dot-com millionaires joined hedge fund kings at the top of the economic food chain. Immigration continued, fueling the city's identity. Dominicans, Mexicans, West Africans, Bangladeshis, and Chinese newcomers arrived daily. Queens became the most diverse borough in the most diverse city in the world. Mosques rose beside churches, Chinese supermarkets beside Colombian bakeries. The city pulsed in dozens of languages. Schools, however, struggled. Public education remained deeply unequal. Wealthy families sent their children to elite private schools or zoned into high-performing districts. Poorer families, mostly families of color, navigated overcrowded classrooms, outdated textbooks, and aging facilities. The achievement gap widened. Efforts at reform sparked protests, debates, and court battles. The city was improving, but not for everyone. Housing costs surged, particularly in Manhattan. Affordable apartments became rarer. Homeless shelters swelled. The waiting list for public housing stretched into years. Evictions rose. Rent control and rent stabilization protected some tenants, but others fell through the cracks. The dream of living in New York, once accessible to artists, workers, and immigrants, was growing more elusive. Still, the city sold itself with confidence. Films, television shows, and magazines branded New York as glamorous, cosmopolitan, and fast. Sex and the City, Seinfeld, Friends, all portrayed different versions of urban life, shaped more by fantasy than fact, but watched around the world. The image of New York, smart, stylish, unstoppable, became a cultural export. By the end of the decade, Giuliani was riding high. Crime had dropped. The economy was booming. He was re-elected in 1997 with strong support. But his critics remained vocal. They pointed to police brutality cases, to racial profiling, to the swelling gap between rich and poor. His leadership style, blunt, unapologetic, sometimes authoritarian, won praise and condemnation in equal measure. And beneath the surface, cracks were forming again. The dot-com bubble swelled dangerously. Rents continued to climb. Artists and working-class families were pushed farther and farther out. The city had been transformed, but not healed. The issues of race, class, housing, and power still pulsed underneath the smooth surface of prosperity. New York had rebounded, no question. It had restored order, attracted wealth, and reasserted its global dominance. But in doing so, it had remade itself into a city that many long-time residents barely recognized. The grit had been scrubbed away, but so had much of the space for the messy, spontaneous, and diverse character that had once defined it. The new millennium loomed on the horizon. The World Trade Center still stood tall over the skyline. The subway was crowded but clean. Tourists flooded Times Square without fear. It felt like the future had arrived. But in less than a year, that future would be shattered. Chapter 14. September 11th. The day the world stood still. On the morning of September 11th, 2001, New York City woke as it always did. Honking taxis, steam rising from manhole covers, bagels being buttered, skyscrapers casting long shadows over commuters rushing into the heart of Manhattan. It was a clear and crisp Tuesday. The kind of day that made even lifelong New Yorkers look up and appreciate the skyline they usually ignored. In lower Manhattan, the twin towers of the World Trade Center stood tall and proud, symbols not just of commerce, but of confidence. At 8:46 a.m., the first plane hit. American Airlines Flight 11, hijacked by terrorists affiliated with Al-Qaeda, slammed into the North Tower between the 93rd and 99th floors. At first, many thought it was an accident, an errant pilot, a terrible misjudgment. Cameras swiveled toward the burning skyscraper, news anchors scrambled for facts, and people in the streets stared skyward, shielding their eyes. Then, at 9:03 a.m., a second explosion rocked the skyline. United Airlines Flight 175 had struck the South Tower. The illusion of accident vanished in an instant. America was under attack. The unthinkable had arrived. The next hour unfolded like a nightmare. Smoke and flames poured from the towers. People trapped above the impact zones made impossible choices. Some waved shirts from broken windows, hoping for helicopters that could never come. Others jumped, falling hundreds of feet to escape the inferno. On the ground, first responders surged toward danger. Firefighters, police officers, paramedics, they didn't hesitate. They climbed stairwells, carried the injured, radioed in confusion, and continued upward. Some knew they wouldn't come back down. At 9:59 a.m., the South Tower collapsed. A rumbling roar, then the unimaginable. A dust cloud swallowed the financial district. People ran, covered their mouths, hid under cars and doorways. It wasn't just buildings falling. It was a world unraveling. And yet, amid the chaos, acts of bravery multiplied. Strangers led each other to safety. Office workers carried the injured down dozens of flights. Ferry captains turned their boats around and evacuated thousands off the island. At 10:28 a.m., the North Tower fell. In under 2 hours, the skyline of New York City, so carefully built over centuries, had been pierced and scarred. The World Trade Center was gone. Nearby buildings, including 7 World Trade Center, were either destroyed or irreparably damaged. Fires continued to burn. The air turned gray and bitter with ash, glass, and human remains. That same morning, another hijacked plane, American Airlines Flight 77, struck the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. A fourth, United Flight 93, never reached its intended target. Thanks to the passengers who fought back, it crashed into a field in Pennsylvania. But New York bore the heaviest weight. In the days that followed, the city grieved. Posters of the missing papered walls and lampposts, smiling faces, hopeful descriptions, phone numbers. Vigils were held in parks, candles flickered in windows. The scent of smoke lingered in the air for weeks. At Ground Zero, rescue workers dug through twisted steel with bare hands, hoping, against all odds, for survivors. Every few hours, cranes would lift debris, and silence would fall as someone shouted, "Quiet!" Listening for a voice, a knock, a breath. Almost 3,000 people had died. Among them, firefighters who rushed in without question, police officers who cleared the way, office workers, tourists, janitors, executives. People from more than 90 countries, Muslims, Jews, Christians, atheists, New Yorkers. And yet, through the pain, something resilient stirred. Within days, American flags flew from windows and bridges. Wall Street reopened in less than a week. Yankees and Mets games returned, their stadiums transformed into places of unity. Artists began sketching murals, musicians wrote songs, and poets tried to find the words. The human stories became a patchwork of meaning. There was Wells Crowther, a 24-year-old equities trader known as the Man in the Red Bandana, who led dozens to safety before going back up and never returning. There was Rick Rescorla, a security chief at Morgan Stanley, who ignored official orders to stay put and evacuated over 2,000 people, singing Cornish battle songs through a megaphone as he led them out. He died going back in. There were the firefighters from Ladder Company 3 who lost most of their crew. The last known transmission from Captain Patrick Brown said, "We're still heading up." These stories, repeated again and again, wove a new kind of mythology for the city, one built not on skyscrapers, but on sacrifice. But healing wasn't quick. The cleanup at Ground Zero, called the Pile by workers, took months. Fires smoldered until December. The air quality was poor, leading to long-term health issues for thousands of responders. And politically, the world had shifted. America launched wars in Afghanistan and later Iraq. Airports changed, surveillance expanded. Fear became part of daily life. New York, always a place of motion, had to learn to pause. In 2004, construction began on the Freedom Tower, later renamed One World Trade Center. Rising steadily from the ruins, it would become the tallest building in the Western Hemisphere. The National September 11th Memorial opened in 2011, with two vast pools set in the footprints of the Twin Towers. The names of the victims are etched into bronze panels, and the sound of water now replaces the sound of sirens. But for many, the true memorial lies not in the stone, but in the way the city carried on. Broadway reopened. Subways resumed. New Yorkers went back to work, bought coffee, argued over cab fares, and raised children. They rebuilt not just with cranes, but with willpower. The skyline had changed, yes, but the spirit remained defiant. The trauma of 9/11 left permanent marks on individuals, on policy, on architecture. It altered the city's relationship to security, to freedom, and to itself. And yet, perhaps the most extraordinary thing was what didn't change. New York refused to bow. It mourned, but didn't surrender. It hurt, but didn't harden completely. And amid the pain, it remembered what it was. A mosaic of people from everywhere, of every religion, every language, every dream. The attacks were meant to divide, to destroy. Instead, they forged bonds. The city became a symbol, not of vulnerability, but of courage. Years later, a child might stand at the edge of the memorial, water flowing endlessly beneath their feet, and ask what once stood here. And a parent might answer, quietly, 2 towers and a lot of heroes. The memory would linger, passed from one generation to the next. Because 9/11 wasn't just New York's tragedy, it was America's. But no city bore it more directly. No skyline captured it more clearly, and no people rose with more determination. From the ashes of destruction, New York began, once again, to rebuild. Just as it always had, and just as it always would. Chapter 15. A New Millennium. In the shadow of the smoldering crater that was once the World Trade Center, New York City faced the daunting challenge of not only rebuilding, but redefining itself in a world forever changed. The early years of the 21st century brought with them a new kind of ambition, steered by Mayor Michael Bloomberg, a billionaire businessman who treated the city like a company in need of strategic overhaul. His vision was sleek, data-driven, global, and unapologetically ambitious. And in many ways, it worked. New York began to climb again. It wasn't just the Freedom Tower rising from the ashes downtown. It was the economy, the skyline, and the global status of the city itself. Wall Street rebounded with force. The finance sector not only recovered, but expanded, now joined by a new generation of tech startups eager to claim their piece of Manhattan and Brooklyn real estate. Silicon Alley was born, a cousin of Silicon Valley, as companies like Google, Facebook, and Amazon planted flags in the 5 boroughs. The old industrial buildings of the meatpacking district turned into high-end condos and art galleries. Williamsburg morphed into a symbol of hipsterdom and gentrification. Glass towers stretched into the clouds as if to prove that New York, once more, was untouchable. But beneath the gleam of redevelopment and economic growth was a story less easy to market. As luxury boomed, affordability crumbled. Entire neighborhoods changed almost overnight, pushing out longtime residents who could no longer afford the rent. Harlem, once a cultural stronghold for Black New Yorkers, faced an identity crisis as new waves of affluent residents brought wine bars and Whole Foods. In Queens and the Bronx, working-class families felt the squeeze. Brooklyn's story became a symbol for both rebirth and erasure. For every park renovated, a rent tripled. For every new bike lane, an old diner closed. Still, the city pulsed forward. Tourists returned in record numbers. Broadway flourished. The subway, despite its chronic delays and aging infrastructure, carried millions of people every day through the veins of the city. Bloomberg's smoking bans, bike lanes, and sustainability efforts won him both praise and scorn. His data-centric leadership style created a more polished city, but not necessarily a more equal one. Then, in 2012, nature sent a harsh reminder of just how vulnerable this vertical city was. Hurricane Sandy, arriving late in the season, crashed into the eastern seaboard with devastating force. Lower Manhattan went dark. Subways flooded. The Rockaways and Staten Island suffered massive damage. Entire neighborhoods were submerged. The city that never sleeps suddenly found itself underwater and unprepared. For all its economic prowess, New York had a climate problem, and Sandy exposed it brutally. And yet, recovery came fast. The city, always defiant, cleaned up, rebuilt, and kept moving. Just a year later, another kind of storm rolled in, one of ideology and unrest. In 2011, a protest began in Zuccotti Park in Lower Manhattan. Its rallying cry, "We are the 99%." Occupy Wall Street wasn't just a protest. It was a cultural shockwave. A rejection of financial inequality, a rebuke of the powerful elite that lived in penthouses while others worked 3 jobs to pay rent. The protesters camped out for weeks, capturing national attention. Though the movement was eventually cleared, its message endured. It was a symbolic moment, born in New York and echoed around the world. As the 2000s marched on, New York's population became more diverse, more global, and more unequal. The tech sector flourished. So did luxury retail. Super-tall skyscrapers like 432 Park Avenue rose, casting long shadows over Central Park and symbolizing the ever-growing gap between the city's richest and everyone else. Real estate became a speculative asset class. Entire floors sat empty, owned by foreign investors who would never call the city home. The term affordable housing became an oxymoron to many. Then came the pandemic. In early 2020, as whispers of a virus turned into headlines, New Yorkers watched nervously. The city had faced plagues before: cholera, tuberculosis, AIDS. But nothing quite like this. When COVID-19 hit New York, it hit hard. Within weeks, the epicenter of global finance became the epicenter of global panic. Sirens replaced subway rumbles. Times Square stood empty. Nurses worked double shifts in overwhelmed hospitals. Refrigerated trucks stood outside morgues. Broadway went dark. Restaurants shut down. The city gasped for air, literally. But even in this darkness, New York found slivers of light. Neighbors banged pots at 7 p.m. to thank health workers. Volunteers delivered meals to the elderly. Community fridges popped up on sidewalks. Artists turned boarded-up storefronts into murals. In the middle of chaos, solidarity was reborn. And then came the summer of 2020. After the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis, the streets of New York filled once more. Not with cabs or tourists, but with protesters. Black Lives Matter chants echoed through every borough. From Harlem to Union Square, from Queens to the Bronx, New Yorkers of every race and background marched in outrage, in pain, and in hope. Police cars burned. Statues were tagged. Curfews were enforced. But the message rang out clear. The city may be resilient, but it is not immune to injustice. The protests exposed old wounds about race, class, power, and justice that had never fully healed. They were also a reminder of what New York has always been: a battleground of ideas, a cauldron of energy, a city that never stops confronting itself. And while COVID-19 was a global crisis, the questions it unearthed about inequality, healthcare, housing, and labor were deeply, painfully local. By the end of 2020, the city stood bruised but breathing. It had lost lives, businesses, and a sense of invincibility. But it had also found something else: an honesty, a rawness, a new vocabulary for pain and progress. In parks and fire escapes, over Zoom calls, and in protest marches, New Yorkers asked hard questions about what kind of city they wanted to rebuild. The answers, as always, were not simple. But one thing was clear. New York, the ever-changing, ever-surviving metropolis, had stepped into a new era. One forged not just in steel and ambition, but in struggle, solidarity, and the stubborn refusal to give up. Chapter 16. The Future of New York. The streets of New York were eerily quiet in the spring of 2020. Once humming with cabs, conversations, and crowded sidewalks, the city fell into a strange stillness. The pandemic had struck with ruthless efficiency. Broadway dimmed, Wall Street emptied, subway cars rolled on, nearly passengerless. It wasn't just a health crisis, it was a profound moment of reckoning. And yet, as it had so many times before, New York waited for its cue to rise. As the dust of COVID-19 slowly began to settle, a new city started to emerge. Familiar, but also strangely changed. The heartbeat was still there, but the rhythm had shifted. Longtime residents were leaving, driven out by the high cost of living or simply seeking space and safety. Remote work had transformed Midtown into a ghost town of glass towers, with office lights off and corner delis shuttered. The city that once prided itself on being the place where you had to be now faced a question it hadn't seriously entertained in generations. What if you didn't need to be in New York anymore? The economic uncertainty loomed large. Small businesses, once the soul of neighborhoods, had vanished in droves. Landmark restaurants closed their doors for good. The tourism industry, a major artery of the city's economy, collapsed under travel bans and fear. Even as vaccines brought hope, recovery was lopsided. Wall Street rebounded quickly, tech startups flourished, and billionaires got richer. But the working class bore the brunt of the losses. Inequality, always present, now felt baked into the pavement. Meanwhile, a quieter, slower crisis simmered beneath the surface: rent. Already astronomical before the pandemic, housing costs remained high even as demand dropped in some areas. Eviction moratoriums delayed the inevitable, but didn't solve the structural problem. In the outer boroughs, gentrification crept forward, sometimes even faster in the pandemic's wake. Wealthier New Yorkers fleeing Manhattan brought their money and their preferences to Brooklyn, Queens, and beyond, often displacing the very communities that had built those neighborhoods. The age-old battle between profit and people returned with a vengeance. Remote work opened new possibilities, but also new divides. For some, it meant flexibility and freedom. For others, especially essential workers and those in service industries, it simply wasn't an option. A two-tiered city began to form. Those who could live anywhere, and those who had to remain, often at greater risk and with fewer resources. This wasn't just a shift in work culture. It was a fundamental transformation of the city's identity. If New York thrived on density, diversity, and in-person energy, what did it mean when so much of that moved online? Even nature had its say. In 2012, Superstorm Sandy had already delivered a warning. It flooded subways, destroyed homes, and exposed the vulnerability of a city surrounded by water. In the years since, the threats of rising sea levels and extreme weather only grew more real. Entire neighborhoods like the Rockaways and Red Hook began to reconsider their future. Infrastructure projects to protect the coastline were drafted, but often delayed or underfunded. For a city that had always built skyward, there was now an urgent need to think about the ground it stood on and what might be underneath it in 20 years. And yet, through all of this, the spirit of reinvention never fully left. Artists took to rooftops and parks when galleries and theaters closed. Musicians played in the streets. Communities organized food banks, mutual aid networks, and tenant unions. Activists marched in the millions in 2020, demanding justice after the killing of George Floyd and others. The Black Lives Matter protests in New York weren't just reactions. They were reflections of a city that has always been both a stage for progress and a battleground for its soul. New York's story has never been a straight line. It surges, it stalls, it crashes, and then, somehow, it begins again. The pandemic didn't break the city, but it did force a conversation. What kind of future do New Yorkers want? Will the next chapter be written by billionaires in penthouses and tech firms turning Soho into server farms? Or by communities demanding equity, sustainability, and access to a city they can still call home? There are no easy answers. The next years will test the city's ability to adapt without losing its character. Can it remain a haven for immigrants, artists, and dreamers, while also being a center of finance, media, and tech? Can it house its workers, protect its coastline, and still glow with that unmistakable energy that draws millions in search of something bigger than themselves? New York has stood at many crossroads before. After 9/11, after the 1977 blackout, after the Great Depression. Each time it was knocked down, bruised, humbled, but never erased. The question now is not whether it will survive. It always has. The real question is what kind of city it will choose to become in the face of its newest challenges. The world is watching. And once again, New York finds itself not just living history, but writing it.